So you've been assigned a rhetorical analysis paper, and maybe you're not quite sure exactly what that means, or you want to make sure you get the whole big picture. So you've come to the right place, because this video is going to tell you all about rhetorical analysis, and you'll want to check all the things I say against your actual assignment, because different professors, teachers will have different little twists on what they want, but I'm going to give you the big picture, and so you'll see how whatever they want fits into that. So first off, let's give a definition. Rhetorical analysis is when you respond to not the topic at hand, whether it's in an article or a movie or a post or whatever, not the topic. For example, if it's about gun control, don't talk about what your opinion is about gun control. That's not rhetorical analysis. You're going to talk instead about, you're just going to critique the way the author presented whatever their points were. Okay? Did they do a good job? That's all you're going to focus on. It's really important on this assignment to follow the writing process and write down all the main points and subpoints, supporting points you want to make. Because if you don't do that, there's a very strong chance that the gravitational pull of habit is going to drag you into that black hole. And here's what it is. Usually, when you read an article and then you're asked to write a report on it, what do? You summarize it, right? You just talk about what the article said. You regurgitate its facts back to your teacher. But luckily, more and more teachers think that's kind of lame to make you just regurgitate and memorize. Instead, they want to see your critical thinking. They want to see your opinions, and they want to see you defend your opinions effectively. So that's what you do in rhetorical analysis. So here's how you do that. You do that by creating solid, effective arguments. And I'll make a separate video about arguments, but here's a summary anyway. First off, you're going to make a claim. For example, you might say, this article was boring. All right. Now that's not a great claim. Actually, it's fine. There are better ones, I'm sure. Many teachers won't like that, but it's fine. It's at least for an example now. Now, if you say it's boring, you need to defend your opinion that the article was boring. So what you do is you go through and you find evidence to prove why it was boring. For example, maybe you used really big complex words that you weren't familiar with, and it made you use your brain too much, and that was hard for you, and so you got tired of it and distracted and therefore bored. All right? Maybe it was very abstract, just these concepts and ideas, and it did not give any concrete examples to help you relate to it. Maybe it didn't talk about why it was important and put it in context, or somehow make it appeal and show why the topic mattered to you. Okay? These are different types of evidence, different reasons why you could claim that a paper was boring. And that's a good thing to do. If you make a claim, then make several smaller claims that support that and prove it in different ways. Now, as you make these smaller claims, make complete arguments there. For example, you can say, it's boring, there's your main claim, because it used big words and big sentences that were hard to understand. Okay, there's a subclaim, you're telling one reason why it was boring, and then you could quote something the author said and show the complex grammar or the big words, or list something like some analysis, like saying the average, I checked the first 10 paragraphs and the average sentence length was 36 words. That's pretty long, or something like that. Okay, there's your evidence, there's your proof to back up your claim that it was complex and hard to read, and then you give your warrant and say, when sentences are that long, it uses jargon and words I don't know, it tends to make it difficult to read and become boring. Okay, so there's one complete argument. Then go on and do the same thing for whatever other proof you have, like that it was really abstract, give an example of that, or explain it, some kind of support, and then tell, the warrant why abstract makes things less interesting than it might have been with some concrete examples. So also make sure that your claims are reasonable. For example, my example, the article was boring. Maybe you were just lazy, right? I mean, sometimes reading things, it does take work. So maybe if you gave it actually a time it deserved to plow through this difficult reading and let it sink in and gather the meaning, maybe it wasn't boring after all, it was just difficult. So make sure your arguments, your claims are reasonable and then support them well with lots of other arguments. Probably the most common thing teachers ask students to do when they do rhetorical analysis is to analyze three aspects of the paper: logos, pathos, and ethos. And those are the things that sum up rhetoric, right? The art of communication, the way things are told, not just what's told. So if you're doing one or all three of those, here's some ideas. If you do logos, you could talk about, are the claims reasonable? Are they well supported? Or is it clearly expressed? Can you understand it? Do they give adequate examples and proof? Do they need more warrant, for example? You could talk about the organization of it. Did ideas build on one upon another? And was it clear, as the paper progressed, how it all got put together? Did it make sense, etc.? So there's a few ideas you could mention about logos. Pathos, you could talk anything about the emotional appeal. Was it interesting? Was it engaging? Was it boring? Was it difficult? Was it frustrating to read? But then was it rewarding in the end? Anything like that. And then pick out reasons why you perceived it as so. If you're talking about ethos, gather up every little clue you can about who is this author, why are they writing this, why do they care, what are they trying to accomplish, what do they know about it, are they experts, were they careful in their research and their writing, or were they sloppy and hasty, are they biased or not. Biased, by the way, you could talk about that in logos as well. The information was biased, it only showed one side, it used manipulative words, emotional words to try and coerce, it appealed to people who already agree, not the other side, for example. And that's one thing you'll find, by the way, very much is logos, pathos, ethos, these three aspects of a presentation of any kind, they overlap a lot. Because if you have bad logos, for example, then it gets frustrating, it gets hard to read, and what does that do to your pathos? It makes it more frustrating and less enjoyable. What does that do to your ethos? It reflects poorly on the author, doesn't it? So they're all overlap quite a bit, maybe more than you'd expect. Okay, here's some other things you can analyze. And even if you're doing logos, pathos, ethos, here are a pair of things you should definitely take into account before you put all your ideas together. Number one, purpose. What was the author trying to accomplish? Why did he or she write this article? Find all the clues you can based on what was written in it, based on any strategies used, any call to action. Did they actually state what they were trying to do? Where it was published? What maybe, if you find out about the author, what their career is, their specialty or their job, or maybe have some company that will make money off it or something. Find out all these things about the purpose and the context. Okay, so that's purpose and context. Then also figure out who is the intended audience for this. Maybe you're reading it and maybe you think it's boring, but did the author really intend for you to read it, or did he write it to a different group and tailor it to them? Right? Maybe you'll decide it was written for doctors or scholars or something because it was published in this article and it used huge sentences and words and jargon that I didn't understand and statistics and stuff. So you can make a great argument for the fact it was written for this group. But then when you say it was boring or not, make sure you're talking about that audience. Like you might say it's boring for you, but if so, identify I'm not that target audience. And for the target audience, it was probably effective. So what I'm getting at here is another thing that is a great idea in rhetorical analysis is to evaluate whether it was effective or not. Okay, to be effective, you just figure out what was the purpose, who is the audience, and did the purpose work for that audience. If it did, it was effective. If it didn't, it was not effective. And of course there are shades of gray all in between where it was moderately effective, got the information across, but it could have been more clear or interesting, or more likely to get a lot of likes and shares on Facebook, right? Also, many teachers may not ask you to just stick to the logos, pathos, and ethos of it. Maybe they'll ask you or invite you or allow you to get a little bit more specific. So here's some other things you could analyze. For example, we mentioned bias. You could analyze bias in it, and that belongs largely to logos, but it also affects pathos and ethos. You don't necessarily have to mention those at all. You can just talk about it was or wasn't biased, and here's why not. And by the way, you can contradict yourself in there. You can say it was it was biased for this reason and that reason, but not for this reason here. That was very unbiased. You can also be precise in your claims where you say it appeared biased, it appeared to be biased because of this, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was biased. Notice, by the way, the difference between bias and stance, because stance is where you take a position, and that's perfectly fine to have an opinion. But does the author then support it reasonably and clearly and thoroughly? Or do they take a stance and not give credit to the other, opposing arguments, or imply that there aren't any, or say anyone who disagrees is stupid, denigrates them? Or does it use slanted words that try and use pathos to manipulate your emotions and your ideas unfairly? It's not always unfair. Sometimes it's just helpful, right? Other things you can identify is strategy. This is a fun one. When you start realizing what strategies are available out there to draw you in and get your attention in the beginning, for example, and then go on. That's a good strategy. When you start realizing the good authors who actually use these strategies, it makes it much more of a game as you read their articles and see all the little games going on behind the scenes that maybe you weren't aware about, and that makes it much more fun to read. And you'll find you have lots of interesting, valid things to say. Here's one more example of strategy. There are different organizational structures. One is called the support structure, where you begin by stating your opinion. For example, let's take an example: gun control is good. And then throughout the paper, you support your opinion with different claims and facts and different more arguments. And if you write this article about the gun control is good, and you write it to, for example, conservatives who think gun control is bad and they want more freedom, Second Amendment rights, all that, then you say it's good, they may stop reading right there. And if they keep reading, they may read and resist you and not be cooperative, have a little chip on their shoulder and watching for any flaws that you make as you write, or as the author writes. So a good choice in that case would be to write, instead of the support structure where you start and then support it, write with the discovery structure where you ask a question and then you pretend to discover the answer as you present facts and build up to your conclusion that gun control is good or bad, or whatever your stance may be. That way people may be more open to your ideas as you go along. So there's an example. Other things you could critique are their arguments. Are they reasonable and well backed up? You could talk about just the purpose. Who is it, and did they accomplish it well? Who's the audience, and did they tailor it well to the audience? Did they capture their interest and supply what they needed from it? You could talk about if the author does something like establishing significance of the topic by giving statistics and showing that it matters, or using words that make you give an emotional appeal to add significance, or tell concrete details that people can relate to. For example, you could talk about how they try and build significance or fail to do so. Either way. And that, in a nutshell, is pretty much the big picture of rhetorical analysis. So read your assignment carefully, and if you're not clear what your teacher wants you to do, then clarify that. But and then also read your article carefully. Go through, annotate. Now that you know what to look for, watch for all these little clues in there. And also be careful. Make sure you believe what you actually say in your paper. Because if you're doing a paper on bias, for example, and you see something where it could possibly mean bias, but it's not absolutely evident, don't put it down just because you thought of it, just to have something to say. Actually make sure you believe that is a sign of bias. And if you don't, either leave it out or state it accurately to say, one red flag that may indicate bias was this, but don't come right out and say the author was biased based on something that might just be stance or whatever. So, by the way, if you're critiquing something that's actually spoken with someone talking, there are so many more things you can go off. You can talk about the way they dressed. You can talk about their voice quality. You can talk about, their movement, their facial expressions, intonation, all those things. If you're talking about a movie, you can talk about the colors and the music and the sound. all these things can fall under rhetorical analysis, because remember, it's all about not the topic, but the way the information was presented. So, good luck. Wish you all the best.